Do you
Right.
think
Oh.
came from earlier writings?
The other thing is they mentioned Q. A lot of you might not know the Q hypothesis. So Matthew copies Mark verbatim and then adds stuff. And Luke copies Mark verbatim and adds stuff. But there's also stuff verbatim between Matthew and Luke that are not in Mark. And so the assumption it came to be, and is still commonly believed, even though the evidence for it is not anywhere near as good as they claim, that there was some other gospel other than Mark that we've lost. And so Matthew and Luke are copying verbatim those two gospels, and they're picking and choosing which pieces to copy from each of those gospels. And this other lost gospel, of course, being a lost gospel, and we have no evidence for it existing, they had to invent a name for it. So they invented the word Q, or the letter Q, which is for the German Quelle, which just means source. So it's this generic source. They just call it source. So this hypothesis, I think, is false. I discuss it and cite all the scholarship, pro and con, on the historicity of Jesus. I think the con argument more than wins the day. The alternative is that Matthew copied Mark and embellished, then Luke copied Mark and Matthew and embellished. So really there's just Luke riffing off of Matthew, riffing off of Mark. There is no other missing gospel. And I don't think in the Gospels we cannot tie any of the other material to any other Christian document. So we can tie Matthew to Mark, we can tie Luke to Mark, and I even think we can tie Luke to Matthew. I think there's distinct features that you can do that with. You can tie John to Luke, for example, like I showed with the Lazarus story. So you can show that they're riffing off of each other and aware of each other. There's no other Christian document that we can find behind them other than, for example, pieces of stories or pieces of sayings. So we have examples of, like, the letter of 1 Clement quotes scriptures that we don't have, some sort of lost scriptures, and says, as the scriptures say, and there'll be some line in there that ends up being the exact same thing that Jesus says in the Gospels right off of his lips. So some of the stuff that's being put in the mouth of Jesus is stuff from these lost scriptures, but they're Jewish scriptures, they're not Christian scriptures. And also, like Paul and some of the other letter writers also say things in their own voice, as their own ideas, and they get imported into suddenly now Jesus is advocating them. So there's some sort of sources like that, but they aren't real sources about Jesus, they're sources about other things that are now being attributed to Jesus. And so that's as far as we can get. There may be stuff, there might be sources behind the Gospels other than that, but we just have no evidence of it being the case besides the kinds of things that I just mentioned. And I talk about all of that on the historicity of Jesus for those who want to explore what we know about the Gospels and where they come from.